We could ask everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this celebration of the life of our friend Peter Livesey. Okay, I'm pleased to introduce Dennis Gray, now retired as General Secretary of the BMC, and really needs no introduction to the people here. And Dennis is going to lead the celebration. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today. Thanks from Peter's wife, Soma, his daughter, Ty, from Alec and his family. Despite his protestations to the contrary, it would have chuffed Pete no end to see you all. Doubtless, like me, at the mention of his name, it will bring back memories of cross-country races, caves, rivers, and climbs, social gatherings, and mutual friends. Thus, I would like us to start this celebration of his life by sitting quietly for a few moments in contemplation, recalling the man, his times, and his achievements. Michael Peter Livesey was, I believe, the most outstanding, all-round, outdoor pursuit performer of his or any other generation. He excelled at so many disciplines that perhaps the title of a polymath is best used to describe him. An athlete, a fell runner, a canoeist, a caver, a climber, and latterly, a veterans champion at orienteering. To say nothing of his talents as a teacher, a writer, an instructor, and in the field in which he earned his living as a college lecturer. But there were so many other sides to Pete's character, such as his maverick wit, his roguish sense of fun, and his love at tilting at the establishment's windmills. And even on occasion, he finished by demolishing them. I first met Pete at Harden Moss cross-country races in 1957. These were held on an open moor above Huddersfield, for there was none of your modern mamby-pamby park-like courses in those days. And the winner of the youth race was an unknown 14-year-old, Michael Livesey, beating by a large margin, and to our chagrin, several of our Leeds Athletic Club kids of a supposed more proven pedigree. Pete was at that time welcomed into the bosom of the Longwood Harriers, Huddersfield's best, in the town where he was born in 1943. In the early 50s, just like climbing, there were clubs in the athletics world that really did breed character. You knew when you went there for an inter-club event that it was muck or nettles. You changed in a drafty, unheated hut and washed afterwards in a bucket of cold water. And anyone who complained was dismissed as a big Jessie. It really was tough of the track stuff, and Pete revelled in it. Although he was perhaps fortunate to have as a mentor Ibbo, Derek Ibbotson, the world mile record holder, who was a Longwood man to his razor-sharp spikes. Under his tutelage, and as he put on years, Mike ran from success to success, setting a new national junior record for the mile of just over 4 minutes, winning the Northern Junior Steeplechase 2 years running, and coming in his last year as a junior, third in the senior race in the 3As, which are the national championships. Anyone else would have basked in the glory of such achievements, but Pete had found the need to earn a living. He was working through an electrical engineering apprenticeship at Broadbents in Huddersfield, and the demands of the training regime necessary to fulfill his aspiration of being #1 in his event, he knew that he just could not meet all these requirements. However, even within his trade, he strove for excellence, winning in his final year the award of the Outstanding Electrical Engineering Apprentice. But his heart was no longer in it, and he decided to apply to train as an outdoor pursuits teacher, and he entered Bingley College. For besides his interest in athletics, he had from a young age been going down caves in the dales and climbing out on the grit in the quarries and outcrops around Huddersfield and in West Yorkshire. Bingley, over the next few years, under the benevolent influence of its dean, Tom Price, and senior tutor, Wally Keay, became, it seemed, the alma mater for half of the then British outdoor pursuits world, and Pete revelled in the new challenges, particularly canoeing. Within a short while, he became a first division slalom canoeist, winning several important whitewater events. His caving exploits were also earning him the reputation of being a bit of a hard man. And I well remember Jimmy Fullerlove, alias Daniel Boone, returning from Ingleton on weekends, sometime in the mid-60s, with stories of the hardest physical specimen he had ever met. Some potholers, we used to call them pothoilers, had adopted Dan and taken him from his first real cave outing in the depths of midwinter, typically down a super severe pot. Their leader had been one, Pete Livesey, who in an open-neck shirt and ripped jeans, there was no wetsuits then, and wearing alpine boots, had led some horrendous pitches, climbing freely up wet, greasy limestone to get them back out of the cave after abbing in. All Dan could keep repeating was, "He's bloody incredible. He never feels the bloody cold." And it took me quite some while to realise that his Pete and Michael Peter of Longwood fame were the same guy. After finishing at Bingley, Pete fulfilled his ambition to become an outdoor pursuits instructor, firstly at Bewley Park in Nidderdale, and then at Humphrey Head on the southern side of the lakes. It was whilst at the latter that he really seemed to get stuck into climbing. And through his work, and typical of the man, he made himself an absolute guru in the safety techniques of our sport. So much so that when I was at the BMC, if we wanted an opinion about any rock climbing technical matter, we turned to Pete. We also turned to him for 2 sets of instructional slides, and through EP in Wakefield, an instructional book on the sport. He later became a valued member of the BMC's training committee and helped to reform the mountaineering instructors scheme. He was also on the MLTB and the Plassey Brennan Management Committee. The SPSA scheme, which is now in so much demand, was actually another of Pete's initiatives, for he foresaw the need for such a qualification with a massive increase in activity by school parties and organised groups at outdoor climbing centres and on the outcrops, Such was Pete's standing as a technician that Al Manson, that most safety-conscious of climbers, remarked only yesterday that of all the people he had climbed with, Pete was the one he would have most trusted his life to. Thus, the scene is set. Pete has begun his great period at the beginning of the 1970s, when he changed the face of British rock climbing. We are now into the real crack, and we'll ask some of those who were there on the rock face with Peter to now actually do the talking. I have great pleasure in asking first Jeff Birtles, to be followed by Ron Fawcett, and then Pete Gummersall to pick up the story. Thank you.
It occurred to me the other day when I was thinking about this talk that Pete Livesey was primarily a rock climber. And then thinking about that, I thought, well, he was primarily a rock climber to me, but to other people he'd be primarily a caver, or a canoeist, or a runner, or an orienteer. And it made me realise how many facets Pete had to his life and how amazingly successful he was. But so all I can do in the next couple of minutes is just tell a few stories about Peter the rock climber that I knew. And typical of Pete, my first recollection of him was when he published an article in a climbing magazine listing the hardest routes in the Pennines. And we'd never heard of this bloke. We were the established team at the time. Suddenly this guy appears from nowhere, and top of the list are routes by Pete Livesey, Pete Livesey, Pete Livesey. And right down at the bottom was Tom Proctor's and Jack Street's and all that. And you think, who the hell is this bloke? So anyway, sometime later, climbing walls were just starting to emerge. And Tom Proctor and I went up to Rothwell one night because we'd heard that was the latest state-of-the-art climbing wall in a gymnasium. And I was sat on a ledge near the top of this very high wall thinking, well, how do I get down from here now? And this bloke climbed up the wall and just said, hello. He says, I'm Peter Livesey. And so that's how I met Peter. And then sometime later I was doing a first ascent of Twicker at Millstone with Tom Proctor, and I was second in the upper slab, just doing a very difficult mantle shelf. And a complete stranger looked over the edge and he said, Pete Livesey's just done the first free ascent of Cave Route at Gordale. And you think, and you're like, what's going on here? You know, and what I didn't realise is that somehow this stranger knew that there was a game on. And Pete was into games. He liked to be where the game was. And in some respects, I don't think he ever truly came over from track athletics to the rather romantic amateurism of rock climbing. Ron and myself and Al Evans, we drove down to Cheddar midweek. And Pete just turned up out of the blue, didn't he? I mean, he must have heard we were going, and he thought, there's a game on. I'm going. He just arrived. He's often been credited with having invented training for rock climbing, and Pete always denied this strenuously. And I think what he did, I mean, people have been trained for rock climbing for many years. And I think what Pete did do is he brought a new attitude to training and rock climbing. And in that respect, I think he had a major influence. And he turned up at Rubicon Wall one day, and he started running up and down. He's completely crackers. And he was doing what he would do at a race meet. He was warming up. And it never occurred to us that. It was just typically Pete. You know, as many people will say today, he was Captain Cool Pete. He was never ruffled in any situation, whether it be social or in a dangerous situation. And I remember in 1975, we were in Cornwall, and he was doing a move where he had his arm right out there, and his shoulder just popped out. He just literally, the whole lump, you could see this thing, and he just fell off. Anybody else would have gone to hospital and had a month off work, but Pete went out the next day and did a new route the next day. And he's just extraordinary, man. And then another time we were at an international meet at Plassey Brennan in 1976, courtesy of the BMC. And Tom and Al Manson and myself, we were trying a new route on the Edwall of Vector and failed on it, which was a mistake because Pete was around. And a couple of days later he slid in and grabbed it and he called it cream. And I never forgave him for that. And finally got my revenge on him by pinching Mortlock's Arrête off him and Behemoth, which he was desperately trying to do. And then I got a copy of Mountain magazine and found that Pete had somehow managed to write to Ken Wilson and get the credit for the first uninspected ascent by Pete Livesey. Oh, that's Pete. Pete was always one step ahead of everybody. And we were in Yosemite in 1977, a whole gang of us, with this, Ron and Pete and Florrie and Pricey and, you know, just a big mob of us. And then one day he said, come on, we're going to go under this route because the lower section of the Yosemite Falls had dried up, and so the wall opposite, Carbon Wall, was dry, which was unusual. And we got there and he was on it, and eventually we found out he'd abseiled down this 500-foot route the day before. And none of us knew. He just sneaked off and he'd run up there, ab down, typical of Pete, one step ahead. And the following year I went to America again with Peter and his brother Alec, and we were in Yosemite, we were down the valley, and there was a big wall, and it was about 300 foot high, and he knew that Alex Sharp had failed to lead it a few days before, and Pete just set off and soloed it. And halfway up I was looking up, and it was rocking forwards and backwards. And I thought, oh gosh, I really thought he was going to fall off. And then he soloed down some meagre hard VS on the right, you know, and I said, I thought you were going to fall off. He said, oh no, I was fine. So I thought I was going to faint. Come on, Pete, you know. And then we went and bummed a bed for the night off Royal Robbins in Telluride, and went up to Crack Canyon, which is at 8,000 to 9,000 feet, and we were doing something which would be about VS on Stanage, but it was very, very, at that altitude suddenly, it was very difficult even climbing at that standard. And then we were doing another route to the right, and Pete was about 100 foot up, and Royal and it's like a big slanting groove like you get on the West Buttress of Cloggy, and Royal just very mischievously said, hey Pete, why don't you swing out right? And he was just winding him up, and Pete went, oh okay. And he just went out over this overhanging wall, up the head wall, and finished with no more runners for 50 foot, new route. And you just think, wow. You know, it's just superb. As John pointed out, there are times to celebrate somebody's life, but it wouldn't be right or proper to touch on any minor flaws that Peter may have had. So we won't mention anything about the chipped hole on claws at Kilnsheath, or the one on Golden Mile, and certainly not the savagely brushed holes on downhill race at Froggatt. We'll not mention any of those. And according to the Times this week, a time when Apocalypse on Cheeto had just been done, and it had a reputation, for the upper pitches, a leftward slanting flake, and as you climbed upwards, the runners behind you fell out, and it was a very scary thing to do. And then somebody ended up with jamming a nut in it. And I thought, wow, this is the time to get out and do it while there's a good runner in it. And then Pete slipped in, did the route, abseiled down, took the nut out. And I phoned him up and said, what did you do that for? He said, because I didn't clip the route. Not on the way up. He said, so I was entitled to take it out. And I had a long, long discussion with him about it. And eventually I said, are you lying? He says, yeah. It was just typical of Pete. You know, he was always into a game all the time. But before I finish, and I know that John Sheard was Pete's lifelong climbing partner, but I'd just like to mention the significance that Livesey and Fawcett partnership had on British climbing, and that Peter took this young lad under his wing early on and knew what a great talent he was, and his instincts was to suppress it. Anyway, and I mean, I think at the time, in the 70s, Pete and Ron together was possibly the most formidable rock climbing team in the world, and it certainly left a great legacy. So just to finish, who was Pete Livesey? I think to the British rock climbing community, he was the most seminal figure of the 70s. He was a great athlete, a great bloke, and I'm sure I speak for us all when I say it was an honour and a privilege to have known him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. To list Pete's climbing achievements would, I think, be out of place here. Anyway, it would take too long. I mean, basically just open any guidebook. I mean, from the lakes to Cornwall, the Verdon to Yosemite. Pete was there. His roots remain a testimony to the man. It didn't seem to matter whether he was at 10 foot or 100 foot, above rubbish gear, often with poor rock. His ability to remain cool was truly awesome. And you must remember, the gear we had in those days was quite archaic, to say the least. I mean, no micronuts, no sophisticated camming units, EBs padded out with a nice thick pair of socks. I mean, there were several other things in Pete's climbing that really, really impressed me at that time. Obviously, the training, the travel. I mean, it didn't matter where in the world it was. If there was climbing to be done, Pete would ferret it out. And these trips always involved, shall we say, adventure. Usually just to buck the system, but more of that later. There was also the ability to make everything he did newsworthy. I mean, he was the best PR man I ever met. I mean, he could have made Skodas sound glamorous. I mean, sure, he had his knockers, but doesn't everybody at the top? I mean, more often than not, these doubters were put in their place, me included, by his superb writing. I mean, usually in our game, there are those that write about it, those that do it. The two are not the same. But I think Pete was an exception. The humour and the wit was always there. He would always display this sense of nonchalance, spontaneity as well. But behind the scenes, everything was meticulously worked out. Be it on the crag, with a wee midweek inspection that he'd never let on about, or in play. I remember the bridge, Sentinel Bridge in Yosemite, the deep river there, the pool probably as wide as this room, cold, very cold water. But Pete knew from his diving days how long he could hold his breath. His party piece at the pool was basically pick up a big granite boulder at one side, walk into the river, 45 seconds later, walk out the other side. I actually tried it and dropped the damn boulder on my foot and nearly drowned. His ability to win points over the competition, as I said earlier, me included. This was actually my 21st birthday at the aforesaid...
Yeah, you had half a pint that day, didn't you?
That's all I could afford, Jeff, come on. BMC International meet down at Plessybrennan in North Wales. And I think I'd maybe been winning too many brownie points that week. And the staff of Plessybrennan decided they wanted to make a video of Pete and I climbing. On this particular route, void, traumatic. Not a big number by today's standards. But anyway, I led the first pitch, Pete followed it. Pete led the top pitch. Basically, the crux move involves big jug, foot up, finger lock, big jug. Pete did the move from the second big jug, reached back down, put a nut in the finger jam slot. So I got there. No chance. I tried to the left, to the right. No way. In the end, I had to pull up on the nut. Big cheesy grin coming over the top. Many, many stories about Yosemite. Astroman. It was a big route of the time, only being done by the locals, the Americans. Pete and I wanted to do the second descent. I noticed he'd been looking at the topo first thing before we set out. And there was one particular pitch that we were really scared about halfway up this route, a thing called the Harding Slot. About a third of the way up, I actually sussed that Pete had worked that I would get to lead the Harding Slot. So I thought, sod this. And we'd got some very, very long ropes with us. So I led two pitches in one, which meant that he got the Harding Slot. He had the last laugh the next day, a climb called Space Babble. Very bold, 10, 12 pitch route on Middle Cathedral. Second descent, as I say. Got to the bottom with a big entourage of Americans wanting to watch us do this route. Sorry, Ron, I seem to have forgotten my harness. You'll have to lead it all. Thank you. In all national parks in the States at that time, every drinks can you bought had a purple stamp on it. You could take that can back and sort of back to the store and get 10 cents a can. Great. So you can imagine everybody, every climber, every scrounger in the park is trying to collect these cans that people have thrown away, take them back, get the money. The thing was, there were thousands of other drinks cans that people had brought into the park that didn't have stamps on. Yeah? So Pete actually whittled a stamp out of a piece of wood. And we had this eyeshadow that we'd pinched off some of the girl. So we literally collected thousands of tin cans, stamped them all. So I think I came home with more money than I went with on that trip. But the last time I was actually with Pete on a crag was during the making of a BBC documentary. The documentary was called Cheat? And we were both arguing their toss about climbing and this and that. But during the making of this programme, the the talk got round to other subjects that were being filmed. And the compere was a guy called Derek Hatton, you know, the councillor, who Pete got on rather well with, as you can imagine. And the story that Pete really liked, football story. Somewhere out on the East Coast, local team, a village league. This team had done really badly. It had lost every match throughout the whole season. This was the last match, and they'd scored no goals, by the way, the whole season. The captain of the team went to the other captain and said, you know, do you mind if my brother has a game? You know, he's just come over for the weekend and would like a kickabout. The brother scored 7 goals. It was David Platt. That really tickled Pete. And I think that was the man. What more can I say? Thank you.
So, what have I got to say? I'm really so sad to be here today. Pete's death is such a tragic loss, but I think he, like me, would have thought, well, that's life. So I suppose to move this occasion from a sort of sombre note to an act of celebration is for me a very simple task. Over the last 10 years or so, myself and Peter had grown apart, but I would still like to think that we were lifelong friends. He was such an influence on me, both in terms of the climbing we did together and on my outlook on life in general. I was 17 when we met. We seemed to have similar views on climbing and life, and a friendship developed. Born, I think, more out of my initial usefulness to Peter as a climbing partner more than anything else. Memorable experiences are many, but I think what happened at Bingley College seems a little blurred to me. But of course, lecturers in those days turned in a really hard, 2 half days a week for a full salary in those days. And that left plenty of time to do, you know, the really more important things in life, like climbing. I seemed to misunderstand what a student was about at that time, because I tried to emulate his workload. And the strange result was I had to spend a year out of college. They said I had to catch up on the work I'd missed. Even at that time, Pete always had an eye on ways to supplement his meagre lecturer's salary. Even then, it involved the food business. Pete was in charge of purchasing weekend course food supplies, and he onerously spent all his budget, even going to the deli. What I could never work out was why his students always starved at the weekend. His next attempt to develop his links with the food industry was a bit more adventurous. He tried to enlist the support of Bonnie Masson to start a chain of Chinese takeaways based in Ambleside, of all places. Unfortunately, this was one vision that Peter had that didn't take off. Our climbing together was 10 unforgettable years with many memorable events. For Pete, it was the route that was left at the end that was the driving force. Often, the means justified the end to him. Whether this is right or wrong is a matter of philosophical debate. But his roots, unfortunately, now stand as an epitaph to a climber of world proportions. Like the others before me this afternoon, he always had to be on top. For him and me, it was always a case of keep the apprentice down. Peals of Laughter, a route we did together on Raven Thirlmere, typified his approach. Pete, even having failed to lead the route, managed to get it written up in the guidebook as alternate leads on a one-pitch route. To this end, he always wanted to see his name first in a first ascent list. I digress at this point at the moment because Dennis or somebody mentioned something about safety. Well, I remember the day we climbed Peals of Laughter. We'd been to Raventhirlmere and we'd just done the second ascent of this classic route up the middle gates of Delirium. And we noticed this chalk on the left-hand side of the cliff. And Pete had suggested we had a look at it. And Pete being Pete, we had to abseil down it. So we tried to get across there. And I shuffled along this ledge, and it ended roughly about the top of the route. And I was shuffling around looking for somewhere to abseil, and Pete scurries across, and he's pulling this hawthorn twig about, and we abseiled off that. He was sure it would hold anyway. I suspect when he realised he was losing the battle against me and other competing climbers, he began to look for another activity, another one he could be number one in. At that point, climbing was a closed book for Peter. I could go on and on with a lifetime of anecdotes, but time is short, so I'll try to round up things. What do I remember now? Going to see him in hospital the night before he came home for the last time. Strong to the last, both knowing his time was up. What was there to say? Nothing. We held each other, shook hands, and said goodbye. A brief 5 minutes I will remember forever. What do I remember most about the time I knew Pete? I suppose a time when he emerged from a not too pleasant time in his life, having just met Soma on a course in Leeds. Way back when, I don't really remember. Thanks very much.